Hi there, it's Larry Lursey. Welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be on exposure. What I'm going to try and do is explain to you the basics of exposure, what it is, and how photographers use it to control the image that they're trying to create in their cameras. And it can be very complicated or it can be somewhat simple. And I'm going to try to break down the basics of exposure and kind of give it to you in bite-sized pieces that will help you understand the big picture. Now, if you own a DSLR, chances are you have a dial like this on top of it. A lot of people have no idea what any of this means, what all these abbreviations are. And what I'm going to try to do is explain to you what the more important abbreviations are and how you will use them in certain photographic situations. But before we do that, we need to understand the basics of exposure. Simply put, exposure is combining shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, how they all work together. And you could kind of look at it as a simple math equation like this, where the shutter speed and aperture are working together. They are amplified by the ISO, and that gives you your exposure. And this isn't quite probably a mathematically correct way of looking at it, but it's just kind of showing us those three separate parts of the equation. And what we're going to do is take a look at each individual part and try and explain that to you. And we're going to start with aperture. So aperture is the opening in the lens. It's simply put how much light that lens is letting in to the camera. As you can see, f1.8 is a very large opening, letting in a lot of light, all the way down to f22, very small, not letting in much light at all. Now, sometimes this can be hard to remember when people are first starting out photography. You know, you're looking at, you would think f22, the bigger number, would let in more light than f1.8. But the opposite's the case. One way you can remember it is think about the distance from the edge of the lens to that opening. And on f1.8, it's not nearly as much distance as it is on f22, where it's a much greater distance. And as that distance gets greater, so does the f number. So if that helps you remember, that's kind of one way I used to try and remember it. But keep in mind, the lower the f-stop, the more light is coming into the camera. Now, this will affect your image in a couple of different ways. First off, obviously, more light coming into the lens. As the aperture is wide open, it's going to let in a lot more light than a closed down f22 aperture. So how much light is entering the lens is one of the things aperture does, but the side effect of that is it controls your depth of field. Depth of field is basically how much of the image is in focus. If you imagine from the edge of your camera all the way out as far as you can see, that whole span, how much of that is in focus? Is the majority of that in focus, or is just maybe a few inches of that in focus? That's what depth of field is. Here's some examples to kind of illustrate that. Same flower shot at 3 different f-stops. On the left, f4, you can see that the flower itself is sharp. The secondary flowers to the left are pretty soft. The background's completely gone. At the far extreme to the right, f22, flower's sharp, the flowers next to it are sharp, and you can still make out stuff in the distance. What all those you're starting to see now, those flowers back there are coming into focus. You could even go with a f32 or even higher and get even more depth to the image. Now, this will also be affected by the kind of lens that you're using and things like that. For example, this was shot with a 200mm lens, which is going to compress things. That's why the image on the right looks like those plants are right behind the flower. They're actually probably 20 feet behind it, but it's kind of compressed, and it also shortens up that depth of field range. So it's not always going to look exactly like this. If you shoot something at f22 with a different lens, that you may have the flowers in the back completely sharp. So it's going to vary depending on the lens you have on your camera. But just to kind of illustrate for you the difference between that f4 and the f22 extremes. And you know, you're going to use this depending on what you want it to look like. If you want a picture of that flower on the left and you don't want the background to be a distraction, F4 would be a great solution. However, if you want more of the garden, to see that we're in a garden, F22 gives you more of the scene. So you've got to decide as the artist how much of that you want in focus, and then you use the f-stop to make that happen and determine how much depth you have. Now that we understand what aperture is doing, let's kind of look at the other side of the equation, which is shutter speed. How the shutter speed affects the photograph. Now, shutter speed is quite simply how long the shutter stays open when you take an image. When you press that button on the camera and hear the click, that's the shutter opening, letting light in, and then closing back. How big the camera opens up is aperture, which we just discussed. How long it stays open is the shutter speed. So the shutter speed will obviously affect the quantity of light coming in. The longer that shutter stays open, the more light will come in. If it's only open briefly, not nearly as much light can enter the camera. What this has a side effect of creating is either freezing or blurring the action. When the lens is open, when the shutter is open on the lens for a long period of time, things start to blur. When it's a very fast shutter, you freeze the action. So keeping in mind what your subject is, if it's someone running, some sort of sports, things like that you're wanting to freeze the action, you're going to want to use a fast shutter speed. If you are trying to create a blur intentionally, maybe you're doing a landscape and there's a little stream going through it, you want that stream to blur, you want the water to blur, you would use a slow shutter speed. And those will work together to give you the effect that you want, but there's always a trade-off. You know, imagine that you've got two different hoses. One is a small little garden hose and one is a giant fire hose. You would say, well, the giant fire hose is going to put off way more water than the little garden hose. But that is only looking at the aperture side of things. If you consider the shutter speed side, then you're saying, okay, well, the fire hose is on for 1 second. The garden hose is going to run for 3 days. Obviously, that garden hose is going to put off way more water in 3 days than the fire hose going off for 1 second, even though it's much bigger. And if you think of exposure that way, that's kind of how shutter speed and aperture work together. The final component is ISO. And you may remember if you did photography back in the film days, you used to buy 400 speed film, 200 speed film. That was the ISO, or sometimes you would say ASA. And what that is how sensitive the camera is to light, how much light you need to create an image. If your ISO is set down to 100 versus way up at 800, the readings on your camera and what your exposure settings will be are going to be vastly different in those two scenarios. A higher number basically means a higher sensitivity to light. So a 400 ISO is more sensitive than 100 ISO. The trade-off, and this is especially true with digital. It was true with film to an extent, but it's really a lot worse, I think, with digital, is that you get more noise. If you were shooting at 3200 ISO, you're going to get more noise, pixelization, little dots of color in the shadows and things, than you would get shooting at 100 ISO. So a lot of times you're going to try to use the lowest ISO you can get away with, but it's also affecting the other aspects of your exposure, which we'll look at in just a second. Generally, you're going to use high numbers for low light situations. You're going to use an ISO 800 or 1600. You would also use this if you really need a fast shutter speed. You can bump up that ISO and that'll allow you to have faster shutter speeds. You will use low numbers for bright light situations. If you're outdoors in the sun, you're doing landscape photography, things like that, you're probably going to be doing more 100, 200 ISO type settings. Again, the trade-off is getting more noise at those higher ISOs. Now there is software, Topaz makes a great denoise software, and there's others that you can work on fixing that and making that noise go away or minimize it, but like most things, you're better off avoiding the problem rather than trying to fix it afterwards. So let's take a look at how f-stop and shutter speed work together. We've got them lined up here with the f-stops going across the top and shutter speeds going across the bottom. Let's say that in a given situation, if you want to photograph at f8, you would need to leave the shutter open for a 60th of a second. You've determined that either your camera's meter did it or you metered yourself with a hand meter, but you've determined that a 60th of a second is how much light you need at f8. If that's the case, you could do any of these other pairings and still get a properly exposed image. f2.8 for 500th of a second, all the way up to f22 for an 1/8 of a second. Those are all going to give you a properly exposed image. The difference, of course, will be that f2.8 image is going to give you a very shallow depth of field. That f22 is going to give you much more depth of field. Another way of looking at it is the first one at 2.8 is going to give you a much faster shutter speed with that 500ths of a second versus the 1/8 of a second at the other end, which will be a much slower and things will blur. So even though all of these are correct exposure combinations, the effect that they will give you will kind of determine which one you should use depending on how you want your image to look. Now here's where ISO comes in. ISO affects the sensitivity and makes it where you need more light or less light. And what that effectively will do is shift these numbers. So now suddenly at f8 you need a 30th of a second, and f11 is 1/15th of a second. And by juggling these three things, the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed, basically you can dial in to the proper exposure that you need and then the proper aperture to give, or shutter speed, to give the look that you want of the image. Again, in this situation, 2.8 at 2/50th is exactly the same exposure as f16 at an 1/8 of a second. So now back to the dial. What do all these things mean? Let's start down here with the P. P stands for program mode. And what that generally means is the camera is going to make all the decisions. You will typically set your ISO, but the camera will choose the aperture and the shutter speed. Shutter priority, or TV, which is time value. Shutter priority is you choose the shutter speed and the camera chooses the aperture. So if you know you need a fast shutter speed, you will switch to that faster shutter speed. Say, I want it to stay at 500th of a second. And then the camera will say, okay, well, if you want 500th of a second, we need to shoot that at f4, and it will make the proper calculations. Kind of the opposite of that is aperture priority, which here is AV. Here you're choosing the f-stop and letting the camera choose the shutter speed. So in this case, you're saying, I want a shallow depth of field. I want to shoot at f4. And the camera goes, okay, well, if we are at f4, we need a shutter speed of 1/25th. So basically, you are choosing the look of the image using either the shutter priority or the aperture priority. You're making one of those decisions and letting the camera make the other balancing decision to make sure that your exposure is correct. Finally, M, manual mode. This is where you do it all. You are choosing the aperture and the shutter speed, which is great because it gives you total control. You don't have to worry about the camera giving you too much depth of field, or however it is. Maybe you want to a little bit overexpose an image, or a little bit underexpose an image. You have complete control. The downside, of course, is you have complete control. It's very easy to mess something up, to go from one light situation to another, and you forget to change your settings. So there's a little more risk in manual mode, but that's kind of eventually where you want to go. That's what the four groupings mean on the side. Most of the others are going to vary by camera, and some of them are settings that kind of tell you the scene, like there'll be a guy running, and that means sports mode, and you would set it to that if you're photographing sports. But you're generally better off using one of these four, I think, because you know exactly what it is you're telling the camera to do, and not just hoping that that icon provides the type of settings that you want. Okay, so where do I start? You've got all these tools now. You understand the basics, hopefully, of exposure. where do you start to try and make that move to having more control over your images? I think Aperture Priority is a great place to start. What I would suggest is switching your camera to Aperture Priority, and basically you're getting some control of the image, but you don't have a huge risk of ruining the shot. You're not going to, probably not going to completely mess something up, but you can still decide if you want shallow depth of field or a lot of depth of field. You're kind of making those decisions and then just letting the shutter take care of itself. For sports or fast action things, you might try setting it at 2.8 or f4, whatever the lowest setting is on your particular lens. If you're going for landscapes, maybe you'd be at more of an f22 or f32. Or you can play it safe at f8. It's kind of somewhere in the middle and give you a little bit of depth, a little bit of speed. And maybe you use that as a jumping off point and try a little bit that way, and then decide, you know what, I need more depth in my images, or I'm getting too much. I want to make the subject jump out even more, and just make changes that way. It really is nice, and eventually you graduate to manual mode. You know, you might be in aperture mode and the camera says, well, it needs to be an eighth of a second, you know, f16. And then you keep those numbers in mind, switch to manual, and then you can tweak those and say, I want it to be a little brighter, a little darker, and you move into manual mode, and then you're controlling both. I think that's where you ultimately want to get when you've got time to really nail down an image. You're in the studio or out somewhere doing a landscape shot, and you've got time to really kind of sit there and go, okay, I want a little more of this, that. Then manual mode is something that you can experiment with at that point. But you know what the different ones are on the dial, and whenever you get confused or if it's just too much pressure to try and get the image done, you just switch back to aperture and let the camera carry some of the load. And that's really all there is to it. Once you understand aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and how the three of them work together, you'll have much more control over your images, and you'll have a lot more fun creating things because you won't just be doing luck of the draw. You will know when you click that shutter probably what the image is going to look like and be able to push that in the direction that you want it to go. And it really is a great feeling when you master that and are able to comfortably control all those parameters yourself. But take it a little bit at a time. Maybe watch this video again if you need to, and just have fun with it. And you will find that the more you do it, the easier it will become, and it'll become second nature eventually. So I do hope that helps. Please like and subscribe if this helped, and leave a comment. Let me know if this helped. I'd love to hear from you. See you soon. Bye-bye.